Hello everyone. In this video I'll talk about covalent bonds in biology. Before going to that, we just say what is a chemical bond. Living organisms are made up of atoms, but in most cases those atoms are not just floating around individually. Instead, they are usually interacting with other atoms or groups of atoms. Chemical bonds play a very important role in the world of biology. Chemical bond is an attraction between atoms due to sharing of electrons between atoms or a complete transfer of electrons from one atom to another atom. For example, atoms might be connected by strong bonds and organized into molecules or compounds, or they might form temporary weak bonds with other atoms. Both strong bonds and weak bonds are very essential for life, as strong bonds that hold molecules together, and weak bonds that create temporary connection, even though they are essential to the chemistry of our bodies and to the existence of life itself. And why the chemical bond, or what is the need of chemical bond? The basic answer is that atoms are trying to reach the most stable state that they can. Many atoms become stable when their valence shell is filled with electrons or when they satisfy the octet rule, that is, obtaining 8 electrons in the valence shell. If atoms don't have this arrangement, they want to reach it by gaining, losing, or sharing electrons via bonds. More generally, bonds between ions, water molecules, and polar molecules are constantly forming and breaking in the watery environment of a cell. In this setting, molecules of different types can and will interact with each other via weak charge based attractions. For example, sodium ion might interact with a water molecule in one moment, and the same sodium ion can interact with the negatively charged part of a protein in the next moment. What's really amazing is to think that billions of these chemical bond interactions, strong and weak bonds, stable and temporary, are going on in our bodies right now, and those bonds are holding us together and keeping us ticking. So this is the chemical bond, covalent bond, that is shared by the two atoms. So covalent bond is when one non-metal shares one or more electrons with an atom of another non-metal, so that both atoms end up with 8 valence electrons. Covalent bond takes place between non-metallic elements of similar electronegativity, and they are formed by sharing electron pairs, and they are stable non-ionizing particles, and they are not conductors at any state. Few examples are given here. Then the strongest bonds that are present in biomolecules are covalent bonds. The most common strongest bonds that are present in biomolecules are covalent bonds, such as the bonds that hold the atoms together within the individual bases. Carbon forms covalent bonds. So typical carbon-carbon single bond covalent bond has a bond length of 1.54 angstrom units and bond energy is 85 kilocalories per mole. Because this energy is relatively high, considerable energy must be expended to break covalent bonds. If more than one electron pair can be shared between two atoms, that is going to form multiple covalent bonds. For example, 3 of the bases include carbon-oxygen double bonds. These bonds are even stronger than carbon-carbon single bonds with energies near 175 kilocalories per mole. So here there is a compound. Is that compound a covalent compound? Yes, of course, because carbon is non-metal and oxygen is non-metal. Since it is made up of made up of only with the non-metal elements, so this is this is the best example for covalent compound. And another example, it can form molecules and here fluorine has 7 valence electrons. Its atomic number is 9, and valence electrons are 7 valence electrons, so that it can if it can attain or it can obtain one more electron from another fluorine atom, and a second atom also has 7. So by sharing electrons, both end up with full orbitals. And one more example is water. So in water, if you see here, one hydrogen and oxygen are there. Each hydrogen has one valence electron. Each hydrogen wants one more, and the oxygen has 6 valence electrons. Its atomic number is 8, and valence electrons are 2s2 2p4, so that 6 valence electrons are there. If it wants to attain stability, it wants 2 more electrons. So both these oxygen and hydrogen, they share electrons between them. So the two atoms come together. The first hydrogen is happy, of course, it is having 2 electrons, but oxygen still wants one more because it has only. So oxygen has only 7 valence electrons. Okay, so this is the second hydrogen attaches, then every atom has full energy levels. So it shares, oxygen shares with the 2 hydrogen atoms, and it attains stability by getting 8 electrons in its valence shell. So that is the another example. And one more example is carbon dioxide. So CO2, carbon is central atom, and its atomic number is 6, and it has 4 valence electrons, and it wants 4 more. So here it shares its electrons, valence electrons, with another atom, that is oxygen, which has 6 valence electrons, and which is requires 2 more electrons. So this is attaching one oxygen, leaves the oxygen one short. So when it shares with with a carbon, so it's going to attain stability with a shortage of 1, and carbon it needs 3 more. So it has 5 electrons, but it wants 3 more electrons. So attaching the second oxygen leaves both oxygen 1 short and the carbon 2 short. So then how it attains stability? The only solution is to share more. So it requires double bonds. So now here, by forming double bonds, each atom gets to count all the atoms in the bond. So if you see, carbon is satisfied with 8 electrons, and oxygen is satisfied with 8 electrons, and another oxygen is also attaining stability because of the 8 electrons. So those are a few examples for covalent bonds, and now we will see types of covalent bonds: non-polar covalent bonds and polar covalent bonds. There are 2 types of covalent bonds. First we will see non-polar covalent bonds. Electrons shared evenly in the bond. Electronegative difference is 0. So between identical atoms this can happen, and it forms diatomic molecules. Then electrons are shared equally, non-polar covalent bond. For example, molecules like H2, Cl2, O2. So these we can take as examples. 2 atoms share 1 or more pairs of outer shell electrons. Then polar covalent bond. electrons unevenly shared in polar covalent bond. There the electronegative difference is greater than 0 but less than 2. So non-polar molecules, sometimes the bonds within a molecule are polar and yet the molecule is non-polar because its shape is symmetrical. So like this. So not equal on all sides. Polar bond between two atoms makes a polar molecule, asymmetrical shape of molecule, dipoles. So this is the example for a asymmetric molecule, dipole, HCl, positively slightly positive charge and slightly negative charge, delta plus, delta minus, space filling model, electron cloud model. Then polar covalent bonds, when electrons, we have seen that these electrons are shared, but they are shared unequally. A polar covalent bond occurs between atoms that have different electronegativity, of course. When this happens, the electrons are still shared, but they tend to spend more time around the more electronegative atom versus the other. Such an example is with water. Oxygen is more electronegative while hydrogen is not. The electrons tend to favor oxygen and spend more time around it. So this is the polar molecule water. Oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen and therefore the electrons are pulled closer to oxygen. So water is asymmetrical. Then it is a bent molecule. So that is about the water taken as an example. Then covalent and polar covalent bonds in biology. So the covalent bonds can be found as gases, liquids or solids and are all around us. The atoms of materials with covalent bonds are bound tightly to each other in stable molecules, yet they are generally not very attracted to other molecules in or around the material. And carbon-carbon single bonds are covalent bonds and form the basis of most of the biomolecules. And if we see how does these chemical bonds work in a cell. In the chemistry of our cells and bodies, with strong and weak bonds play key roles. For example, strong covalent bonds hold together the chemical building blocks that make up a strand of DNA. However, weaker hydrogen bonds hold together the two strands of the DNA double helix. So these weak bonds keep the DNA stable but also allow it to be opened up for copying and used by the cell. So hence both strong bonds and weak bonds like hydrogen bonds are also essential for the living organism. So few examples of biology. Glycosidic bonds, they are the covalent chemical bonds that link ring shaped sugar molecules to other molecules, and they form by condensation reaction between an alcohol or amine of one molecule and the anomeric carbon of the sugar, and therefore may be linked to oxygen or nitrogen linked. So this is the monosaccharides like glucose, fructose, galactose are held together by a type of covalent bond known as glycosidic bond. When they are connected together, they can form larger carbohydrates. So two monosaccharides link together and form a disaccharide. Such an example is table sugar, that is sucrose, which is composed of two monosaccharides, that is glucose and fructose. And another example is glycosidic bond in DNA, which refers to the nitrogen carbon linkage. So this linkage happens between N9 of purine bases and C1 of the sugar group, or N1 of pyrimidine base and C1 of the sugar group. So here this is the glycosidic bond which takes place between sugar molecule and purine or pyrimidine. So helical twist, the angular rotation is needed to get one nucleotide to another in helical structures. And if we see polar covalent bonds linked together amino acids in chains creating peptides, they can also be found holding together amines. Peptide bond is also a chemical bond which is formed between two molecules when the carboxyl group of one molecule reacts with the amino group of the other molecule. So in this water molecule is released. This is a dehydration synthesis which is known as condensation reaction and usually occurs between two amino acids. So that bond is peptide bond. So first two amino acids are brought together, then acid group of the first is close to the amine group of the second. Next a water molecule is eliminated and a bond is formed between the acid carbon of the first amino acid and amine nitrogen of the second amino acid and forms a peptide bond between these two amino acids. So this is regarding the polar covalent bond which is a peptide bond. So these are a few examples that are covalent bonds in biology. Thank you.